Welcome to day 3 of Natural Beauty Summit's Detox Your Lifestyle and Reset for 2022. I'm Salome, Sallehy, your host, and also the founder of Sugar Wax. And today I'm going to be talking to one of the most interesting people that I have had the pleasure to interview. Colleen Mizuki has so many credentials, I won't even try to list them all off for you. But what I will say is that her work is absolutely fascinating in the area of mindful resilience. Now, if there's anything that we have learned over the course of the last 20 months is that resilience is and has become really the key of our survival. But having change all over the place, having systems that are changing right before our eyes, having our lives turned upside down has produced an incredible amount of stress. And in this conversation with Colleen, we're going to be talking about identifying chronic stress, and she will be sharing 3 of her most effective ways of coping with chronic stress. Now, this woman has worked with the most high stress, high intensity professionals in the world, from leaders in the military to diplomats and across many, many other professions. But what she trains these individuals on. What Colleen does is she works with these people who are in high stress jobs or positions all over the world to help them regulate their systems. And this is an incredibly important conversation as we start to think about, how to detox our lives. Stress can be a huge source of toxic overload. Not only does it throw off our hormonal balances, which is really our stress coping mechanisms, but it affects our health throughout our entire system. Without further ado, I give you Colleen Mizuki. Welcome to Detox Your Lifestyle and Reset for 2022. I'm Salome, Sallehy, your host, and I have the immense pleasure of chatting with Colleen Mizuki, who is the founder of Avenir Dynamics. We're going to be talking about stress and mindfulness, and you're going to walk away from this with some tools in your tool belt to better deal with all the changes that you're either going to create or the holidays and the New Year is just going to throw on you. So welcome, Colleen. It's so great to have you.
Thank you, Salome. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you.
I have been so looking forward to this conversation for so many reasons. But I kind of want to just start with, figuring out the baseline for stress, because I think we all know on some level that stress is obviously toxic for us. And I don't think I know anyone that hasn't been intensely affected by some stressor or other at some point or other. And now here we are, almost 2 years after a global health crisis. And there isn't a person on the planet that hasn't been affected by it. And there's so many layers of stress, from like the uncertainty and, well, we can go on. We've all been living through it, but a little bit different for everybody. But I would love to get your perspective on what chronic stress looks like and how do you know if you have it?
Well, great lead in. And I totally agree with you that everybody has stress. And let me just say at the outset, stress by itself is neither good nor bad. It's just a fact of life. I think we all probably recognize that there are some positive stressors and some negative stressors. And yes, we've all been affected by COVID and the changes that have taken place and the uncertainty of it. Whether it's been somewhat positive for you or not, it's generated a lot of uncertainty. And yes, a lot of stress. having said that, I don't know a single person, and I know a lot of people through, I'm older than you are, and I know a lot of people, and I've worked with a lot of people, and I think it's safe to say that I've met nobody who isn't dealing with too much stress. That's just the way it seems to be. And I would just say we can get into a little bit of the science more later, but just at the outset, our systems, and when I say our system, I mean our brain, our mind, and our body system, because it's always working together. It's not optimized for chronic stress. It's actually designed, wired, created, whatever verb works, for really big stressors, like life or death stressors. And to be able to recover from them, to be able to sort of expand our zone of tolerance to stress so that we're ready for the next big one. But that is not how we're living. We've got stressor after stressor after stressor after stressor.
Like, I think especially after the last couple of years, everyone can agree that like chronic stress has definitely taken its toll. But I mean, I'm almost thinking of like, should we be taking a step back and looking at like, why are we constantly in chronic stress even before COVID? Do you have any theories on that?
It's our lifestyles. It's the way that life is designed now. So I think the main point is, and I imagine our viewers will recognize this, we get up in the morning, we have 20 things on our mind that we need to get done before we even get to the office or to the virtual office. We've got kids, we have bills, we have phone calls, we have emails, we have social media, right? We have just so many things bombarding us, so much information, so many demands on our time. And while none of it's not all bad, it's just there's a lot of it. So it's just the nature of existence now that we don't have. And let me just say really quickly what I mean by we're optimized for really large stressors, and then we can move on to your other question, which is so important. Well, how do we know? And how does it show up? So our brain, mind, body system hasn't changed that much over the millennia. We pretty much have the same brain, mind, and body. And it was really optimized for living in a tribe, fighting the big animals or the tribe over there, and warring and running and killing and fighting, and that was survival. But when that huge stressor was over and we were able to retreat to our living space, we may not face another major stressor for a day or two or three or four or five. And our system had a lot of time to what's called down regulate. So we have this surge of hormonal changes and energy changes when we're facing a stressor. And then we run or we fight or we use up a lot of those hormones, and then it passes and we can settle. But we don't get to do that now. We face a stressor and we start to downregulate, and then we had another stressor and another one. So our system never fully recovers. And that's what's going on. So what do we do? How do we know? How do we know, right? How do we know that we have too much stress?
I just want to pause you for a second, because I think that really underscores how important what we're talking about today is, and how important the learnings and the takeaway and the tools are, because we're literally being like hit with wave after wave. We're drowning in our stress. And I don't think that everyone thinks of like stress quantitatively. It's more like abstract. So to kind of allow you to continue on what that looks like, I think will allow us to really like recognize the signs and how it shows up.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So how it shows up, what are our signs? Each one of us is different. We're individuals, of course, but there are some pretty consistent signs of chronic stress. One of the most common ones that I experience and that I hear from the thousands of people that I work with is it's often a mind that just won't settle down. It's busy, it's spinning, it's even when we have a moment to take a breath, we often will fill it with something else. It's almost as if our system has become so used to this constant onslaught of stressors and a stress response that we don't even know how to have a quiet space. Right?
That was me last night.
We turn on the TV, we look at social media, something to keep feeding that almost that angst, that high level, that high octane, boom, 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 boom. That's a really, really clear sign that there's too much going on. When we can't tolerate quiet, when we can't tolerate a little mental space that's not bombarded with something. So we end up reaching for something to bombard it.
Oh man, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah. So that's one sign, and it's like the mental sign. Then there are the physical signs, chronic headaches, chronic tension in the neck, jaw is tight all the time. Right, some of those initial signs.
Check.
Exactly. I'm sure you're not alone, right? The jaw, the tight, then the heart palpitations and the stomach upsets and the digestive issues. That's a sign that the system is out of whack. Okay, that's some physical sign. Trouble sleeping, trouble falling asleep, trouble staying asleep, right? And then mood swings. I mean, there are so many signs that we often don't associate with chronic stress. Even what really surprises people when I show a list of signs of chronic stress is weight gain in the middle of our bodies. Because every time we have a stress response, even if it's a good stress, like something we want, the system has a reaction. And one of those reactions is to produce the hormone cortisol. Cortisol is unnaturally occurring. We need it. We're supposed to have it. It helps us stay alert and fight infection, for example, and even convert fat to energy. What happens though, and this is clinically determined, chronic stress, one of the signs is we gain weight in the middle of our bodies. We start to accumulate weight there. So there are just so many things. Hair can fall out, right? Face breaks out, pimples, right? Eating habits change. So I would say that generally, probably everybody is suffering from some chronic stress, except for maybe people who are able to get away regularly and not fill their space with something. It really takes quiet. And by that, I don't just mean not having auditory input, but quiet in the mind.
So I guess, would it be safer to say then, like, you are probably not chronically stressed if you can just kind of chill out and like have quiet without stimulation, without reaching for your phone, without turning on the TV, without, and then just be okay with it.
That's probably a good sign. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know anybody like that.
I don't know many people like that, right? We don't. And here's the interesting thing. We will talk about, okay, so when you talked about putting tools in tool belts. So one of the things that I would love to talk about would be some of those tools. And what I will say right up front is that the tools at first might be difficult because the brain, mind, and body aren't used to it. But once the body gets a taste of it and the brain and the mind get a taste of it, it will ask for it. It's kind of like, eating healthfully.
Yeah.
Once we start eating healthfully and the body knows what good eating is, it asks for the apple or the cottage cheese, right? It doesn't ask for the chips anymore.
Yeah.
So when we have this tool and we utilize it and the brain, mind, body knows what it feels like to regulate, it will ask for it.
Okay.
Interesting.
So let's just go back. You started talking about the cortisol and the science of it. And I think, one of the dangers of living with chronic stress is you don't necessarily know that you're in a state of stress. You think that this is normal. Now, if you had to boil it down to a chemical reaction in the body. There's the cortisol. Are there other hormonal things going on?
Absolutely. Great question. There's a cascade of hormonal effects, right? And the point of those hormones is to generate energy, right? It's to generate energy to mobilize us to respond to a perceived or real threat or challenge. That's just the normal response. So there's adrenaline, for example, right? We all know about adrenaline, right? It picks us up, it gives us energy, it increases the heart rate, which increases blood and oxygen flow. But I would really hone in on cortisol, because that doesn't break down as quickly. So every time we have a stress response, the phone rings, we have a deadline we forgot about, there's a bill we didn't pay, kids are needing something, right? They're home from school and you're trying to work, and they have online learning, and right, all of those will generate a cortisol response. And again, I'm not saying cortisol is bad, we have to have it. But every time we have a stress response, cortisol is produced along with adrenaline. Adrenaline will metabolize and break down faster. Cortisol can stay up into the system for 10 to 12 hours. It can, and it builds up. So that's the one that I think is probably the most dangerous. And I think that's borne out by medical research and science, that it's the buildup of cortisol, the chronic cortisol that's in our system, that leads to disease actually in the brain and the body. And so it's
You're freaking me out, because I'm like, that's me.
that's all of us, really. It really is. You are not alone. That's all of us. So the good news is we can do something about it.
Okay.
We can.
Okay. And we're totally going to get to that. But before we kind of move on, I just want, because you've touched on this a couple of times, and I've read about it in different contexts. We talk about good stress and bad stress. I think there was a book that I was reading that like defines it as like eustress versus distress. Can you talk about the two different kinds of stress, and does it like chemically look different in our bodies? Or are we just, when it's eustress, we're just in a position to like use up that adrenaline and metabolize the cortisol better, versus distress where you're kind of like helpless and you're like, I can't do anything about this. I just have to keep juggling my like 700 balls all day, every day.
Yes. Okay. Very, very, very good questions. Very, very smart questions. Eustress, yes, is generally referred to as good stress or beneficial stress. Then the distress is obviously the distress, that it's not working so well. The way that I like to talk about this is I often draw an inverted U, and it's been around for over 100 years. It's called the eustress curve. It's a Yerkes-Dodson curve. Okay. So bottom line is it's the relationship between performance and stress. And performance can be how well I'm thinking, how well I'm remembering, how well I'm engaging in social relationships, communicating. It could be sports, performance. It could be any type of performance. How well are we being and doing as well as, the way that we want to? So if we're at really low levels of stress, that means we don't have a lot of cortisol in the system. We don't have a lot of adrenaline. Our heart rate's pretty low. If it's too low, we've all experienced that. We're sitting in class and we're bored to death. We're not thinking clearly. Somebody would ask us a question and it injects stress, and then suddenly the brain's alert. But it's that sort of that couch potato, icky sort of blah feeling. So between that and sort of an optimal level is eustress, where the stress level is going up in the system. The cortisol's going up, the adrenaline's going up, the heart rate's going up, and it's pulling us into an alert state, a state of I'm processing quickly, I'm remembering, I have clarity of thinking. Some people, and it moves us toward what some people call the zone, right? Athletes will often talk about being in the zone. And it's when it's almost timeless, right? We don't live there a lot of the time, but the eustress is moving us to that place of optimal performance, where we're thinking clearly, we're remembering, we're making good decisions, we're communicating effectively. That's good stress. And we have to have that. Otherwise, we're not alert, and we're not thinking, we're not remembering, we're just not processing. Then we reach that zone, which is sort of at the top of that upside down U curve. That's where we are in prime optimal mode. What happens is when there's too much stress in the system, we start to go down the other side of the curve. That turns into distress. And what that means is there's too much for us to be thinking clearly, remembering as well, recalling, making the best decisions, articulating our thoughts. And of course, it's going to have its health effects. So that's really the difference. And so one of the things I like about the tools that we're going to introduce is one of the key things is they help us know our best level of stress because it's different for everybody. So when am I at my best? What that means is when is that stress level just right? And what does that feel like? What does that look like? What does it sound like? And if we practice these tools enough, we know when we start to slip into the distress part of the curve. And then we can self-regulate and try to move ourselves back to that zone.
Oh my gosh, that sounds like utopia, because I know what you're talking about with the couch potato thing. I feel like if I'm not, and I never really thought about it as positive or negative stress, but I know that there has to be a certain level of stimuli for me to be effective and productive. And I hate slipping into that zone of like, I don't want to do anything. You know what I mean? Because then I just feel bad about it after. So I didn't think that that was the lack of stress. I just thought that that was just, like not enough life demands making me lazy. And I've had very few episodes of that. But thank you for clarifying that. I want to talk a little bit about what you do, because it's fascinating. And our viewers will have probably gotten a little bit of a preview. But what's fascinating to me about that right now is the people that you typically work with are not scenarios that we as like civilians at home feel like we can relate to. But I think given what we've all kind of gone through over the last almost 2 years, it's more relatable. And I would love for you to just talk about that a little bit. Tell us about
my so I sort of have two lives. One is the work that we're talking about here, which is the Avenir Dynamics. I also work as what's called a Department of Defense contractor. So I work in the DC area, and it's a job that is quite interesting. I work with high-level Department of Defense employees, many of whom are former military, most of whom, not all, but most. And they're now civilian employees, but they work for the Department of Defense, and they're experts in a particular field. It could be intelligence, cybersecurity, HR, logistics, all kinds of areas. And they have chosen to deploy, to go to another country for 1 to 2 years as advisors. And they're advising in the area of what's called institutional capacity building. So the Department of Defense actually spends a lot of money, not just on war stuff, but preventing war. And this is the area of preventing war. So sending advisors and training them to be advisors to go to countries that are not as stable, right? That they're either fragile states or looking like they could become fragile states, or countries where there's a lot of corruption, and so that creates instability. So they can be countries like Iraq. It used to be Afghanistan, but now we're not obviously there. Ukraine, Fiji, Jordan, Botswana in Africa, Tunisia, so all around the world, where they're really still working on creating a more stable infrastructure for society to function really well. And so these are folks who are trained to go there and work with their ministries to help stabilize. So I work with them to help prepare them. And part of that preparation is also this whole resilience performance piece. So that's in a nutshell what I do in my full time. My passion piece is what we're talking about.
So what kind of work do you do with them? I guess I kind of want to segue into the breathwork stuff.
So what I do with them, and actually what I also do, I work a lot with military folks, particularly National Guard and Army Reserve, who are folks who have spent a lot of time in the last 20 years in the war zone. And so for the last 15 years or so, I've been working with them in a similar way. So I'll describe what I do with the military. I attend events where they're either preparing to deploy to a country, or they're coming back and they're trying to reintegrate into their lives here. And in all cases, I talk to them about this. I talk to them about stress, how to recognize the signs of too much stress, and how to self-regulate so that they're constantly kind of like keeping their engines tuned up, right? Which is what we all need to do. So that we're, I sort of liken it to, we go through the day and we have a lot of gas in the system. There's a lot of acceleration and then a little bit of brake and then mostly gas. And I want to teach people how to regulate so that we have gas and brake and gas and brake. So I talk to them about what we're discussing, and I run them through different exercises and these tools. And then we talk about what happened during the exercise so that when they leave, they have a sense of, out of these 5 exercises, I like these tools. I like that one the most. And I know how to do it, and I know what to look for, and I know how to integrate it into my day. So that's a lot of what I do when I work with the military.
That's awesome. We've been talking a lot about breath work, and even in the summit, I think there's at least like 3 conversations where the topic comes up. I personally don't really have a deep understanding of breath work, and I would love to get your perspective on what are the different types of breath work. Can you give us an overview?
Sure. So there are many, many different types of, I'm glad you brought that up, of breath work. And what I tell people is, to some degree, they may do some of the same thing, but not entirely. So for example, there are a number of breathing techniques that are really just designed to relax the system. So relaxation techniques. There are some that are designed to regulate that gas and that brake pedal that I just talked about, right? They're really designed for that. There are some that will do that to some degree, but they're actually an attention focused brain mind training breath work. And then there are others that say the yoga pranayama breath work, which has a lot to do with, it can be relaxing, and it's also good for just energy flow. People talk about the energy channels in the body, chi. So there are some breath work techniques that really are just trying to unblock the energy. So there are breathing techniques that come from a variety of traditions, right? And so the one that I tend to teach most, I teach 2 types. Either mindful breathing, so it's a mindfulness breathing approach, which has a slightly different subset of effects than what I call self-regulation or system balancing breathing, which regulates the nervous system, which regulates that gas and that brake pedal. So again, there's a little bit of overlap in their effects, and yet they both do also very different things.
Can you give an example? Because for me, like, I know that when I breathe, I feel better. I don't really know the difference between, the gas and the brake and the regulation. So if you can kind of give me an example of like, this would be an example of this type, and this would be an example of this type.
Absolutely. So do we want me to guide you in a practice, or just talk about it? What would be best?
Well, I'd love to get into a practice for sure. Is that a better way of illustrating it? Sure.
So let me describe first. I'm a little torn between 2 or 3 different breathing practices, but one that I will describe first.
Okay.
And it's the one that I often recommend that people start with, because I think it's the easiest to do, and it helps stabilize the mind and the attention so the mind doesn't wander quite as much. And it's not as important if the mind stays stable, but it immediately has the effect of letting up off the gas pedal and adding a little brake pedal so that we start to get the system a little more balanced. So it would be, and I'll describe it and then we can try it in a little while if we have time. It's basically taking your attention and putting it on your heart, in your heart area. So there's a reason for that. But I'll just say you take your attention and you maybe visualize the heart area or the center of the chest, and then feel your breath moving in and out of that area. So if you just sort of slow down the breath and deepen the breath just a little bit, but see if you can feel it coming out of the heart area. And then just allow that to sort of settle in. So it's a little deeper, a little slower. And you're tuning into the heart. And then what we would do is we would breathe in the same number of seconds that we breathe out. So often we start with 3 seconds breathing in through the heart, and then 3 seconds breathing out. And just following that pattern as long as it's comfortable. So breathing in for 3 seconds and out for 3 seconds, and just allowing that to flow in and out of the heart. And what we would do with that practice is ask people to find a rate that's comfortable for them. So it can be 3 in and out, 4 seconds in and out, or 5 seconds in and out, not going above 5. And depending on where your system is, one of those will feel better than the other. The most important thing is you never feels tight or never feels constricted, because we need to be careful with the breath. And if anybody ever feels a little constriction in the chest or any feeling of panic, we just don't attend to, we just go back to breathing normally. But there's a whole physiological reason for that. So that would be one. That immediately regulates the 2 branches of the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system.
So what just happened was I was trying to do it as you were talking about it. And I went from like, okay, my chest, it's here. And like trying to pay attention to it, but definitely not feeling my heart. And like 3 breaths in, I can fully feel every beat of my heart. Wow. So why is that a break? Is it just because I'm getting in my body, out of my mind? Like, why is that good?
Well, so that's great. So it's good because normally what I would start with before even doing a breathing practice is I have people ground and sort of draw their attention into their body. I just skip that part. But normally, and I would have them sort of just feel the weight of their body in the chair and really tune into the body. But what you did is you were able to do that. So your awareness level increased. So you're now aware of the heart beating, which is great. Many people can't feel that right away. So if people are watching this and they try it and they don't feel their heart right away, don't worry, right? Some people will, some people won't.
I've been doing a lot of breathing.
So that was great. So what happens is when you breathe in the same number of seconds as breathing out, it's actually forcing the system to self-regulate. And there's a longer, complicated explanation of it, and it has to do with the autonomic nervous system. So maybe
I want to know just a little.
Okay. So every time we breathe in, our heart rate naturally goes up. It's almost the fight or flight response. That's just natural. And every time we breathe out, the heart rate slows a bit. So it goes down. So in other words, if I'm exaggerating and I'm breathing in, my heart rate might go boom, 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 boom. Okay. So breathing in, heart rate goes up, breathing out, heart rate goes down. So as we go through the day, can you imagine when we have a stressor, we breathe in, we breathe in, we breathe in. What's happening to the heart rate? Heart rate's going up, heart rate's going up, heart rate's going up, right? It's like a gas pedal. Very rarely do we stop and let the heart rate go down.
That's so interesting, because I was going to ask you, how do we normally breathe? Because I don't even think I'm aware of how I'm breathing, but that is exactly what happens.
And if we think, and when I do a breathing class with, say, the military, I have them breathe normally. And I ask them, where do you feel the breath? What do you feel moving? And most people say, my shoulders, not the belly, shoulders, which means we're inhaling, but superficially. So we're not really getting a lot of oxygen deep into the lungs, right? So there's another breathing practice, which is called diaphragmatic breathing, which allows the diaphragm to drop so the lower lungs fill. So that's a different breathing practice,
Okay,
right?
before we get into that, let's talk about baby steps. So the first one, same number of seconds in, same number of seconds out. You're focusing on your chest. How long do you need to do that? Like, what is like, you need a bare minimum of this much to start regulating versus like, you can do it for hours. Like, where's the optimal benefit?
So it's different for every person, and it also depends on the state of stress in the system. But I would say with that breathing practice, if people were to try it, if our viewers are watching and trying it, I think that what I have found from my own experience and from teaching it and from the research, it'll immediately start to have an effect. You may not notice it right away, but it immediately is regulating the system by breathing in the same number of seconds as breathing out. So the beautiful thing about this practice is you can do it anytime. While you're driving, you're in traffic, somebody frustrates you at the store, you're standing in line and you're in a hurry and you feel like you just stop and while you're waiting in line, you breathe in and out of the heart, 3, 4, 5 seconds. Pretty soon you've moved up in the line, your system is regulated. So it can be a minute, it can be 2 minutes, it happens immediately. So the longer you do it, the more regulation you're getting, but it has an immediate effect.
So funny because as you're saying all of this, I'm thinking about like, when I get worked up and my husband's like, just breathe. And it makes me so angry when he says that. I'm like, you breathe. And then now I'm like, oh, because I'm literally not exhaling when that happens.
Right.
So let's talk about the second method.
So the second, I actually, do we have time for 3?
Yeah, we're going to do all
Okay.
3. I'm like so ready for all of this.
Okay. So the second one, I think we should do a 3-part diaphragmatic breathing, and it can be a little tricky, but we're going to try it. Okay. And only because we're not used to breathing that way. But I always ask people in my audience, I say, how many of you have a baby or you've been around a baby? And people raise their hand. I'll say, how do they breathe? What's moving? The belly. The belly. As we get older, we forget to breathe deep into our bellies. So that's why this one can be hard at first.
Yeah, this one, so after our last conversation, I've been trying to practice it. So just a warning, I'm going to be really good at this, but then I asked we were in the car and I'm like, trying to do my breathing, and I've picked up the kids from school and I asked my babies, I'm like, hey guys, I want you to just tell me when you breathe, where does the breath go and where does it come out of? And for them, it's like the belly, obviously, where else would it go? I'm like, great. Hey, I'm trying to do that right now because I forgot. So,
yeah. And it's really important because I mentioned a little while ago, when we do shallow breathing, we're not really getting enough oxygen deep into our lungs where the most effective exchange happens. So what we want to do with all breathing practices, it's helpful if we're not, slunched like this, right? Because it's harder. But in particular, when you're doing a belly breathing, it's important to sit upright. So we don't want to be super stiff, but where the spine's nice and long and the belly can expand. So I'm going to describe it first and then let's try it. What we're going to do is we're going to actually imagine that our chest to our lower navel part is almost like a balloon. And when you blow up a balloon, the air goes in the bottom first, right? And then the top expands. And when the air leaves the balloon, the top starts to shrink down and it goes out the bottom. So if we think about that, we're going to first breathe deep into our lower belly. So it's going to expand, but then we're going to try to move the air up into our diaphragm area, that tight band right underneath our rib cage. So the lower belly will expand and then the middle belly expands and then the chest expands. So it's, again, imagine a balloon, and the air is coming in the bottom of the balloon, and then the middle of the balloon is expanding, and then the top of the balloon is expanding. So the air is moving up into the chest. And then as we exhale, we sort of compress the chest, we compress the diaphragm, and then compress the lower belly. So it's just reverse. So it's starting with lower belly, belly's filling up. And immediately when we really push the belly muscles out, we already feel it expanding the diaphragm. Because what happens is by extending the belly, the diaphragm can drop, and then air can come up into our lower lungs. So taking a nice deep breath into the lower belly, feeling it expand.
So I find it a little bit easier to do it if I just push my belly out first.
Yes.
And then
yes.
when I'm exhaling, I'll like contract the belly.
Exactly.
And I feel like it seems like really counterintuitive at first, but just like focusing that motion on my belly and just like not so much necessarily on the breath, but like moving the breath, moving the belly first, letting the breath in. I find it easier to breathe into my belly, like for more breaths than if I were just like focusing on expanding. It's funny, as we were doing that, like the right side of my back, like totally like spasmed.
Oh, talking about it or doing it?
No, when I was doing it. Okay, let's do it.
It could very well be that the muscles aren't used to working like that.
Yeah, they're not.
And the other thing is, I will say, and it's going to sound a little strange, but it's true, that when we've been really activated, when there's been a lot of stress in the system and it's being held in certain parts of our body, in muscles and in cells, when we start to regulate and downregulate the system, we might actually feel a spasm, a jerk, a twitch. It's the system sometimes downregulating. It's like it's releasing energy in a burst. But I love what you said, because that's exactly what I was doing. I just wasn't saying so. Is when I breathe into my lower belly, it's expanding way out. I'm pushing it out to let the air fill the lower belly. And that's exactly right. And that's actually a good way to just start, is just lower belly, pushing it out, and then contracting it. And getting used to that feeling of that balloon down in the lower belly, really pushing out and then coming back.
After like 4 or 5 breaths, I feel like there's so much more space in my whole like torso.
Yep. And there is even more of it's a yoga based breathing, but actually it then pushes the energy even all the way out. But that's a more complicated breath. So that's a 3-part diaphragmatic breathing. Okay. And then there's mindfulness breathing, which is very different.
Before we get into that, I'm going to pause you again. For those of us who are doing this at home and they want to make a practice out of this, is there like a certain time or like length of time or time of day, or in a situation, like I know with the diaphragmatic breathing, its posture becomes a little bit more important than the in and out. Any other tips or like routines that you kind of want to share, that when you're trying to do this breathe exercise, try to stay within these parameters?
So, not a real simple answer. I'll try to keep it as straightforward as possible. Initially, probably most people will have to set particular times when they do it. Eventually, it will become such a normal part of their day. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our talk, the brain, mind, and body will ask for it. But initially, because the hardest part about these practices is remembering to do it. That's it.
Yeah.
It's just remembering, right? And so it has to become a habit. So what I would recommend is that people decide when they wake up in the morning and they're still lying in bed, that they're going to try a breathing practice, whichever one works best for them. Okay. And they can actually find these online as well. You can just Google heart focused breathing, coherence breathing, or diaphragmatic breathing, for example. But I would recommend when they wake up in the morning Just maybe set a second alarm and take 5 minutes to just feel the body in contact with the mattress. Notice the weight of the head and the shoulders and different body parts, just a way to ground the attention in the body. And then try the breathing practice for 2 minutes, 3 minutes tops. And then maybe set an intention for the day. This is how I want my day to be, right? This is what I'm grateful for. Something that brings that feeling of purpose and mission and serenity, because that's a perfect cap to the breathing exercise. Then book in the day, start the day and end the day that way, right?
Oh my God, I love this. This stuff is so powerful.
It's so powerful. So at least beginning and end of the day. If people are feeling particularly ambitious, maybe put it in their diary, their calendar, and blink at noon to take 5 minutes to just close the door, turn off the whatever, and just feel their body in the chair, feel their body in the weight of their body in the chair, ground, and do 3, 4, 5 minutes of the practice. And that right there starts to set a pattern. And eventually what happens is they'll integrate it. They'll start noticing when they're breathing this way, or when the mind is spinning, or when they can't make a decision, or when they're snapping at somebody and they're like, ooh, breathing practice.
Yeah.
Or I'm about to go into a really challenging conversation, or I'm afraid of how that person's going to respond. Let me do, especially the in and out, 3 seconds in and out, 4, 5, regulate the system. And then as they start the conversation, they can, once they're used to it, they can do the breathing while they're having the conversation. They can, once you get used to it, and it's amazing how much clarity we have. Here's why. It helps regulate the signals from the body to the brain and the brain throughout. And so there's less chaotic noise in the brain when we're regulated that way.
So as we're having this conversation, I'm doing the belly breaths. I really love the belly breaths, but I really enjoyed those couple of minutes of doing like the heart focused breathing. I don't think I've done that very much, or maybe even at all. It feels so different.
Yes, it is different. And
So
it's really powerful.
We get into why that feels so insanely different. Let's talk about the third type of breathing.
Okay.
And then if you guys can do it with us. I mean, you're already putting in the time. Just do the work while you're here.
You might as well, right? So the third type that I will talk about is a mindfulness practice, which is different from what we just did, right? And I just want to say, what is mindfulness? Mindfulness practice, and it is a practice, right? It's nothing we ever become expert at. It's a practice. All it is it's taking your attention and intentionally, purposefully putting it on somewhere very specific, on something very specific, like the breath, and leaving it there moment by moment, and allowing the experience of the breath and tracking the breath without judgment. And what I mean by that is, when we start doing these practices, particularly in mindfulness practice, we start to notice how busy the mind is, how judgmental the mind is of ourselves and others, of our experiences, of noises, of everything. Like, I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't like that. That's bad. And there's a lot of judging that takes place of ourselves and others. So what we want to do when we do this practice is, we're not controlling the breath in mindfulness breathing. We're allowing ourselves to track the sensations of breathing in and breathing out. So we're not forcing it up the diaphragm. We're allowing the body to breathe just as it wants to breathe in that moment. And we're just trying to anchor our attention to the sensations of breathing in and breathing out. This is tricky though, because the mind gets really bored. And it's going to let in music and thoughts and memories and planning. And all we want to do without judgment is notice that, oh, I'm not focusing on the breath right now. I'm thinking about what I'm going to make for dinner. See if I can bring my attention back to the sensation of breathing in. Oh, there it goes again. No judgment. Now I'm thinking about what my sister told me on the phone. Oh, I'm going to bring it back to breathing in and breathing out. And it's a very powerful practice, but it's not simple. I mean, it's simple, but it's not easy.
So as you're sharing that, I'm trying to just observe my breath without like taking big breaths. And my brain is being very judgy. It's like, oh my God, your breaths are so shallow. You're not even going past your sternum. Like, what have you been doing? Why have you been breathing like this? How bad is this for you? And to come to the judgment, because I think there's so many different thoughts about that. Is the purpose of the mindfulness to kind of disarm the judgment, disengage judgment? Are we observing judgment and then judging ourselves for being judgy? And then like where what is the goal, and like where are we netting out here?
Yeah. So there are many, many goals and many outcomes to mindfulness practice, many. But to keep it narrow to this conversation, and not to minimize it, because what I'm about to say is really important, is it is to observe the experience and to allow the experience. So what we're not doing is saying, oh, you're so judgmental, stop being so judgmental, right? It's more like, oh, there's that judgment again. Wow, okay, I see you judging mind, right? Okay, I see you. And now you can go do your judging thing, but I'm going to turn my attention back to my breath. And there's something very powerful about allowing experience, not resisting it, not embracing it, not encouraging it, allowing it. And so that's a very important aspect of mindfulness practice. And it's also helps stabilize attention, so it has some very clinical neuroscientific benefits, right? Because the more we're able to anchor our attention to something as subtle as the breath, kind of boring as the breath, right? The more able in any given moment we are to see when our mind goes, boop, boop, shiny object, squirrel, right? And instead of staying focused on the conversation that I'm having with my partner, right? How many times do people say, you're not listening to me? Well, we're probably not. We're all thinking of our next response. So it helps us catch that. So yeah, it helps us with the judgment, because we all do have judgment. But it's just helps us open up to the experience. One of the things that people often say who practice mindfulness is they say yes to all experience. Right? Say yes to all experience. And so if it's something that's really painful, say yes to it. It doesn't mean I'm embracing it and wanting more of it. It means that is my experience right now. That is my sadness.
Why is that important? Because, you know, like I think in meditation, I've tried to practice some version of this, right? And it's like you just let your mind do its thing, you observe it. But I don't know. I've heard from other people that meditation is like the most powerful tool that they have in their toolkit. I don't know if it has become that for me. Is there like a threshold I need to pass? Does it have to be meditative? Because now you're also saying like, oh, you could just be having a conversation with someone. And then just, can you just be like observing yourself doing something? Or do you really just want to make it more of like a meditative state?
So I hope I'm going to answer your question, but let me tackle it and
I know I
see,
asked so
because it's
many
a really
things in there. I'm sorry. There was a
no,
lot.
it's okay. It's a very important, and I think what this points to is meditation. There are different forms of meditation. Mindfulness is just one, right? And they all will do some kind of like other breathing practices. There'll be some overlap to the benefits and the outcomes and some differences. So when we practice mindfulness, one of the outcomes is greater awareness. I'm more aware of my I'm more aware of my tendencies and my habits and my urges and my thoughts and my judgment. Another outcome is I don't get pulled by them. I notice them and I don't get sucked into some story. It comes and goes. None of us are always practicing, right? we still get sucked in, even those of us who practice mindfulness. We're still human beings, right? We still lose our temper. But so I'm sort of answering the question, and it's complicated. So the practice is to stabilize your attention on your breath and notice what comes up, but don't get sucked in by it. So that has different outcomes. It does make you more self-aware, right? So the practice is both self-awareness, and the benefit is self-awareness, if that makes sense.
Yes.
That's as mindfulness practice. That's different from, say, transcendental meditation or other forms of meditation, but mindfulness practice is what I'm talking about. And then, of course, it has health benefits. It has very specific health benefits too. So I often talk to people about, we are so impacted by our sort of subliminal urges and habits and judgments, and they're always acting on us. So the more aware we are of the urge to respond a certain way, or to reach for the bag of chips if we're trying to eat more healthfully, or to fill our mind with noise so that we don't have to be with ourselves. If we start noticing those habits, then we have choice. It's when we don't notice that we are choiceless. Does that make sense?
So much so. And that, I think that is the power of the awareness, is choice, because you can't do anything or be anything without choice. You can't make progress anywhere without being able to choose to make a change. Oh my gosh.
Yes. Choice.
That's epic.
Yeah.
Okay. So one last question. So we're going into the holidays, and, there's all kinds of different stressors, whether it's like we have to hang out with like family that might stress us out, or, we're stuck. God forbid someone has to go to a mall, but like, in traffic, trying to find parking. Like the holidays are always a little bit chaotic. So what would you kind of recommend for, I want to kind of break this into like a few different levels. Someone who has really never partaken in any kind of breath work or meditation, they just know that they have to breathe. Like what would you kind of give them to, as a tool, like recommend for them to practice, and like how should they practice it, versus someone who's like maybe more like me, who has like dabbled in all kinds of different things, but never really like been consistent with any of them? Or you have someone else who's like maybe more like you, who, well, maybe not quite like you, but closer, somewhere between you and I, where they have, they have some practices that helps, and they're pretty self-aware, but they still find themselves getting caught up in situations that they don't feel necessarily like they have a choice. I'm going to use that word choice so much from now on. So for these three people, like, what would you kind of recommend as like a starting point during a high intensity time like holidays? And like, what would you say? Like, if I was like, Colleen, I'm going to do whatever you tell me to. I have never committed to meditation or breath work long-term, but I really want to make this change for 2022. What would you give me as my homework? So that's 2, 3, 4 questions right in.
No, that's perfect. No, so what I would start with is something that I did not do. I only spoke about. I would recommend for all of those categories of practitioners, let's just call us practitioners because we're all practicing, right? One of my best phrases is that I didn't make it up, but we're always practicing something.
Yeah.
In every moment, we're practicing good habits or bad habits, or good thoughts or bad toxic thoughts, right? So we're all practitioners, if you want to call us that. So whatever the level of practitioner, a very beginner to an experienced, I always believe in integrating what I call, other people do as well, a grounding practice. And that's what I was describing earlier, and I kind of just brushed by it.
Yes.
But it's whether you're standing in line, sitting down to dinner or at a meeting, waiting for a Zoom call to start, going to bed, waking up. Take moments before you shift in your transitional periods, waking up, sitting down, standing up, as much as possible. Ground, meaning right now, you, I, anybody listening, can you take your attention and feel the weight of your body supported by the chair or the couch or the bed, wherever you're sitting? Can you just drop your attention and really feel the sensation of sitting? That's it. That's grounding. And what happened? What did you notice?
I've noticed that I've never noticed, or I've never experienced sitting before.
And what happens is when we draw our attention into the body like that, to something solid, you can be standing, you can be sitting, you can be lying down, but something where your body is in solid contact with another surface. And when you draw your attention there, you are speaking to the nervous system. And the nervous system is what responds to stress. And you're saying to the nervous system in the only language it speaks, which is sensation, hey, it's all good, I'm safe. I'm safe right now. There's no tiger running. There's nobody. I'm okay right here, right now. And that starts to settle the system. So when we get into the car, before we start the car, feel your butt. I would say feel your butt in the chair, feel your butt in the seat, feel your feet on the ground. And then if you have time, I actually really recommend that for people, especially at the beginner end of the spectrum, after grounding for 30 seconds, a minute most, you're going to feel the system start to settle. Then go to the heart focused breathing. 3, 4, or 5 seconds in and out, just for a minute or two. And notice what happens. You're going to feel yourself go zoom. And then with practice over time, you'll notice other effects like, wow, I can see more clearly. I'm processing faster. I'm responding better. That for everybody, because a lot of meditators don't necessarily do that heart focused breathing.
No, and I have to say that one probably felt the most lovely when I was doing it, even though it was so short-lived. Like, I can't wait till after the Zoom I go and do it again.
Yeah.
And the other thing I'm kind of noticing is, and I've heard people talk about this, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Of course it is. But they say it like I'm sitting in this chair and feeling the sensation of sitting. I feel supported. I feel like something other than myself is holding me up, like the chair.
Yes.
Which is, I've heard that, oh, feel yourself being supported. And I'm like, what does that mean? And I'm feeling that feeling now. That's crazy.
It's really powerful. And so for people along that practitioner spectrum, those two practices are always a good way to start a practice, whether that's the extent of it until you get used to it, or that's the start to your meditation practice, because you can never go wrong self-regulating and down-regulating the system. And so for people who are serious practitioners, then just extend their practice. Just add 5 minutes to their practice every day.
Okay, so I think it's really reasonable to be able to, I love the transitions when you're like getting up from your desk, when you're going to do something different, to just feel that sensation of whatever, whether you're standing or you're sitting or whatever. I mean, in this conversation, this is a sidebar, but like my neck and shoulders in the middle of my back that felt like it was doing this has like really relaxed.
Yeah.
Like we started this and I was like, oh, I need a massage. And now I'm like, oh, like my shoulders just feel like a lot more relaxed right now.
Yes.
Anyway, sorry, to go back to what y'all should be doing. So the transitions and just taking 30 to 60 seconds. I'm going to say like that's my limit. 30 to 60 seconds is really, really reasonable.
Very reasonable.
So you're not jumping from one thing to another, because then you're just regulating and then starting something else, which is now, if let's say I'm, as you can tell, I'm like highly ambitious. I'm going to make this my practice. So if I were to say, okay, Colleen, I'm going to commit to doing my transitions, and I want to kind of build up the practice, what is like kind of my end goal? Like, what milestone do I want to be hitting? Like, oh, I can meditate for like 5 minutes, for 10 minutes. And like, what is that milestone? How do I know I'm leveling up? Aside from the obvious benefits of I'm going to feel clearly less tension and all of that.
That's a very hard question to answer, because depending on the practice, I would have a slightly different response. So you're right. The obvious benefits are you're going to start noticing the tight shoulders before they stay tight for 5 minutes. You're going to notice them, and then you're going to be able to, so that self-awareness piece that allows choice. The less ill effects of stress, definitely. If somebody out there, if you or somebody else decides they want to do, say, a mindfulness practice or another form of meditation, what's the end goal? It is always to up your practice. It is to add practice time for whatever your life will allow, right? So it could be that somebody's goal is to practice 3 times a day, 10 minutes, right? And they're going to work their way up to that. But what happens often is they get to that 10 minutes and they're like, oh, I could do 15. So it's such a personal choice. And I don't want to give somebody their end goal, because that takes away their self-agency. So it's the whole beauty, really fundamental, I think, about this is it's that self-awareness piece, so that people know what they need, right? They know when they haven't been practicing enough. I know when I haven't been practicing enough. Funny story, when my daughter was 7, 8 years old, she's now 23, and I got off my practice a little bit. She was about 8 years old, and she said, Mama, have you been practicing enough lately? So she noticed it, because I was probably less patient. So people will notice, and we will notice when we need more, right? Or when it's right for us at that point in our lives. So I don't really have a clear-cut answer.
No, I think that's a fantastic answer. And I think kind of an extension of what we've been talking about, a couple of themes have emerged, choice being one of them, self-agency being one of them. And as you were describing the effects of awareness, I realized that like so many people that are, highly annoying or like really intolerable to us, well, like to me, let's say, they're just lacking the awareness. If they were a little bit more observant of themselves, they'd be like, oh, maybe that's a little too much. Or like, oh, maybe this feels better for me, even for like the first person. So I think where I'd like to kind of like what I'm concluding from our conversation today, and I did not expect to end up here, but is that it's about taking responsibility for yourself. Like the stresses are going to come, and you can always choose to just be the victim and be reactive and live in like a state of discontent. Obviously easier said than done, but like by building that awareness, giving yourself choice, giving yourself that agency to like follow what feels right to you, that's responsibility. That's you taking ownership of your own state. And that is a really great place to kind of conclude for me, because I didn't expect this conversation to go here.
I think that's beautifully said. And I think that points to the fact that this practice, while we can start out it being just to relieve stress or to help counteract the effects of stress, the ripple effect is enormous. And it is both within my sphere of my own self-agency and choice, but the more regulated I am, because our nervous systems are always interacting, I'm also helping others regulate just by being more regulated in my response and in my own like vibrational state. So it affects the whole world actually. So it's pretty cool.
Thank you so much, Colleen. That has been definitely one of my favorite conversations and some things I really needed to learn and hear. So thank you for sharing all that with us. Any final words of where our audience can find you, or tips, or any final thoughts?
Well, just want to say how much I enjoyed it. And I really appreciated the time and the questions. Your questions were just so perfect. And they showed me the deep intention that you have for helping people be at their best. And that's my intention as well. I love having the opportunity to do that. So thank you. Thank you for the time and the opportunity to share this, because it is really exciting, powerful stuff. So Avenir Dynamics is my company, and but somebody can Google my name. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm upgrading my website, so it's down right now, but it'll be up soon. I'm just always up for this kind of a conversation. It makes me very happy. So thank you, Salome, and thank you for what you're doing out there. It's just great to have people like you out there in the world.
Thank you so much, Colleen. That means a lot. And I think we can wrap it up there. Enjoy your time in the holidays. And now you have some tools to deal with some of the stress that is surely going to come along. Thank you for tuning in.